Vietnam, Quang Tri Province, July 1970. The monsoon rain had stopped minutes earlier, leaving the ground soaked and red, like someone had poured paint over the earth. The night air shimmered with humidity. A fire base on the outskirts of the DMZ slept in an uneasy quiet, broken only by the distant thump of artillery far off in the hills. Inside one of the wooden hooches, a platoon sergeant named Miller was writing his nightly report by flashlight. It was his routine. He wrote every night, even when most of his men had long stopped caring. He believed routines kept chaos away. He never saw the hand that slid the M26 fragmentation grenade under his cot. He heard the metallic clink, and for one fraction of a second looked confused rather than afraid. Then the world dissolved into smoke, splinters, and blood. When the dust settled, one detail stayed burned into the memories of those who found his body. The grenade pin was found pressed into the dirt, not from explosion, but from a boot that had stepped on it while leaving. Whoever killed him hadn't run. They had walked, deliberate, calm, unhindered, as if killing their own sergeant was just another task on the nightly schedule. This was not an isolated murder. It was part of a pattern so disturbing, so corrosive, that the U.S. Army tried to suppress its full scope for decades. The men called it fragging. When a soldier killed his own officer or NCO with a fragmentation grenade, the military's own internal memos would later call it something else: the hidden crisis. How does an army get here? To understand why American soldiers were killing their own leaders, we have to step backward, to a time when the Army believed itself unbreakable. In 1965, at the start of large-scale involvement in Vietnam, the Army looked strong, united, disciplined. Lines of clean uniforms, polished boots, sharply barked commands. The illusion of stability. Battalions were filled with career professionals. Most men were volunteers. They knew their leaders, trusted them, believed in the mission, and understood their place in the machine. But by 1968, that machine was cracking. By 1969, it was rupturing. By 1970, in some units, it was fighting itself. The ground war changed before anyone realized it. If you look at maps, you'll see battles. If you look at documents, you'll see victories and casualties. If you listen to veterans, you'll hear something else entirely. We weren't fighting the North Vietnamese anymore. We were fighting our own chain of command. The war America had prepared for wasn't the war they encountered. Instead of clear front lines, there were booby traps. Instead of decisive battles, there were ambushes in the dark. Instead of rotating men by unit, the Army rotated individuals. It was a policy decision that shattered cohesion. You could be assigned to a squad of strangers on Monday, lose 2 of them by Friday, and be given replacements next week who didn't even know your name. Some soldiers began describing their company as a bus station where everyone arrives alone and leaves alone. A unit like that cannot form trust. Without trust, discipline collapses. And when discipline collapses, leaders become targets. Younger, angrier, and drifting into disbelief. Early in the war, the average American soldier in Vietnam was 25 to 26 years old. By 1970, the average infantryman was 19. These were teenagers drafted into a jungle halfway around the world, fighting a war they didn't understand, led by officers who often rotated out every 6 months. Long before, learning how their men thought, fought, or survived. The soldiers weren't the polished volunteers of 1965. Many were drafted from poor neighborhoods, rural counties, urban ghettos, places where political elites never visited, and where patriotism often had a different meaning. Confusion grew. Resentment simmered. Meaning eroded. Some soldiers openly asked, "Why are we here? What are we dying for? Who even cares?" These weren't abstract philosophical questions. They were survival questions. When men no longer believe in a mission, they don't just disobey. They reject the authority that tries to enforce it. Why officers became targets officers in Vietnam often struggled with an impossible contradiction. They were expected to push their men aggressively into dangerous areas. Their men increasingly believed these missions were suicidal and pointless. It wasn't ideological rebellion. It was primal, practical, immediate. If you make me walk into an ambush again, I might not come back. But you will, and that's not fair. Some soldiers started warning their officers. "Don't send us into that valley again. Stop pushing night patrols. You're going to get someone killed. And occasionally, if you keep forcing this, you won't make it out either." This was not mutiny. It was something more chaotic, more dangerous. It was the collapse of consent, the foundation that makes any hierarchy function. When consent evaporates, the chain of command becomes a target, and in Vietnam the easiest, least traceable weapon in the field was a grenade. No fingerprints, no ballistic signature, a blast that erased evidence, a murder that could look like an accident, a weapon that turned the jungle into a judge. Fragging, the symptom of a dying system. Fragging wasn't planned revolts or ideological assassinations. It wasn't part of a conspiracy. It wasn't coordinated. It was a symptom of leadership distrust, poor cohesion, drug addiction, racial conflict, rotating replacements, meaningless missions, the collapse of morale, and the slow death of belief in authority. By 1971, some divisions recorded dozens of fragging attempts per year, dozens of successful killings, hundreds of unreported threats. In some battalions, officers refused to sleep without their boots on, a loaded weapon, a sandbag barrier between themselves and the door, or in extreme cases, sleeping outdoors away from their own barracks. There were captains who told new lieutenants, "Don't ever raise your voice, you're not giving orders, you're negotiating survival." The Army had become two armies, one wearing officer insignia, one holding the pins from M26 grenades, and those two armies no longer shared the same purpose. Do you think fragging happened because of the war itself, or because of how the Army was structured at the time? Which one failed first, the mission or the institution? Drugs, desertion, and the loss of control. By 1970 to 71, the Army wasn't worried only about fragging. They were worried because fragging was only the tip of the problem. The deeper issues were: 1. Drug addiction. Heroin use skyrocketed. Marijuana was nearly universal. Soldiers often smoked on patrol. Addicted men can't follow orders. They can't maintain discipline. They can't be led. 2. AWOL and desertion. Tens of thousands left their posts and never returned. Some units were losing 40 to 50% of their manpower. 3. Combat refusal. Entire platoons refused to go into dangerous valleys, night patrols, or repeated ambush zones. 4. Underground press soldiers created secret anti-war newspapers within the military, a sign that the Army had split into factions. The command structure was cracking like old glass. And the sound it made wasn't loud. It was quiet, invisible, internal, like a building collapsing from the inside. The officers who slept in their flak jackets by the early 1970s, there were U.S. officers in Vietnam who did something almost unimaginable. They were more afraid of their own men than of the enemy. Some captains slept fully dressed, boots on, helmet within reach, flak jackets still on their chest, not because they expected a night attack from the Viet Cong, but because they weren't sure what would happen if one of their own soldiers walked in, holding a grenade. There are accounts of lieutenants barricading their doors with sandbags, moving their cots away from windows, refusing to share sleeping quarters with enlisted men, avoiding walking alone through their own company areas at night. Once, an officer reportedly taped a handwritten sign above his bunk: "If you want me dead, do it in the field, not in my sleep." Was it a joke? Was it a dare? Was it fear disguised as dark humor? Whatever it was, it captured a terrifying truth. The front line wasn't always out in the jungle. Sometimes the front line was the space between an officer's bunk and the door of his hooch. A company that stopped listening. Picture this. A rifle company in the Central Highlands, 1970. Officially, it is combat effective, with enough men, weapons, ammunition, and vehicles. Unofficially, half the platoon is high on marijuana most evenings. A quarter of them experiment with heroin. Almost no one believes in the mission anymore. Nobody trusts the battalion commander. The company commander is counting the days to go home. And in the middle of this is a brand new lieutenant, fresh from the States, fresh from officer school, carrying a clean map case and an untested sense of authority. On his first week, he tries to assert control. He insists that hair be cut shorter. He orders inspection of weapons. He demands that patrol formations follow doctrine perfectly. On paper, he's right. In the field, he's suicidal. His platoon sergeant pulls him aside and says quietly, "Sir, with respect, if you try to play hard ass with these guys, they're going to make sure you don't last long." The lieutenant shrugs it off as exaggeration. He believes discipline is the answer, so he pushes harder. He cancels slack time between patrols. He volunteers his platoon for extra ambush missions. He chews out a few soldiers publicly. He threatens Article 15Es and courts-martial. A week later, someone slips a note under his door. It has only one sentence. "Go easy or you won't go home." There's no name, no signature, no indication of who wrote it. Is it a serious threat, a bluff, a dark joke? He doesn't know. And that uncertainty is the point. From that moment on, every order he gives passes through a new filter in his mind. Will this get me killed? Not by the enemy, but by my own men. When leaders start negotiating for their lives, fragging didn't turn every officer into a victim. It turned many of them into negotiators. In theory, military orders flow one way, from the top down. In Vietnam's crisis years, some orders began flowing the other way, officers asking their sergeants what the men would accept, patrol plans being altered to avoid open refusal, night movements quietly scaled back, mission profiles adjusted to keep risk lower than the anger threshold. Instead of, "We are going on patrol tonight," that's an order. It became, "We're scheduled for patrol tonight. How do you feel about the route? Is there any part of the valley the guys absolutely won't go into?" This wasn't kindness. It was survival diplomacy. The chain of command had become conditional. Authority was no longer inherent in the rank. It had to be earned, or at least not provoked. In a way, fragging turned the Army into something it was never meant to be. A workplace where employees held veto power over life and death assignments, not through formal channels, not through unions, but through the quiet, terrifying possibility of violence turned inward. When leaders fear their followers, the system has already failed. How the institution responded. Denial first. Large organizations rarely admit deep internal failure right away. The U.S. Army was no exception. At first, fragging was treated as isolated discipline issues, criminal anomalies, the work of bad soldiers, or the byproduct of drugs and counterculture. Reports were buried or softened. Commanders underreported attempts. Some incidents were labeled accidental explosions. Others disappeared into vague categories, but numbers have a way of leaking. Journalists, veterans, and a few honest officers began assembling a different picture. Hundreds of threats. Dozens of confirmed killings. A pattern linking fragging to certain units, regions, and timeframes. A clear correlation between low morale, high casualties, and leadership targeting. Eventually, some internal studies quietly acknowledged a bigger truth. The Army wasn't just fighting the enemy. It was being eaten from the inside by distrust and disillusionment. Yet publicly, official statements doubled down on a different message. High professionalism, strong discipline, tactical success, isolated incidents. The gap between the public narrative and the internal reality grew wider every month, and soldiers notice a gap like that. They always do. A lieutenant's diary. The moment of recognition. Imagine a young lieutenant, 2 weeks after almost being fragged. He sits at a small wooden table, the light of a single red-lensed flashlight barely illuminating his notebook. Outside, the jungle hums. Inside, his heart races with the leftover adrenaline of a day that never made the official report. Earlier that afternoon, a grenade was found tucked behind his cot. Pin still in, spooned, placed, not dropped. No one saw who put it there. No one will talk. Everyone swears they didn't notice anything. He writes, "This is not the Army they trained me to lead. Back home they taught us about tactics, fire superiority, combined arms. Nobody taught us how to command men who don't believe in the war or in us. They told us about enemy fire. They didn't warn us about friendly hate. He closes the notebook, not because he's finished, but because he knows that if someone reads what he just wrote, he might be in even more danger. Not from the enemy, from the institution. What fragging was not to really understand this crisis. It's important to strip away some misconceptions. Fragging was not a coordinated anti-war conspiracy, a political revolution inside the army, a formal mutiny in the classic sense. Most of the men involved were not ideologues. They weren't quoting philosophers. They weren't trying to overthrow the system. They were scared, angry, exhausted, and felt trapped in a war they didn't choose, under leaders they didn't respect, inside a structure that refused to admit failure. For some, fragging became a warning, a punishment, a twisted form of negotiation, or a desperate attempt to regain control over their own survival. Many fragging attempts never used live grenades, pins left visibly in boots, inert devices placed in bunks as threats. Rumors circulated loudly enough for officers to get the message. In that sense, fragging wasn't just about the explosions that happened. It was about the explosions that didn't happen, because the threat alone altered behavior. The real weapon wasn't the grenade, it was the possibility of the grenade. Morality, morale, and the math of human psychology. In strategy lectures, we often hear about firepower, logistics, doctrine, technology. But Vietnam's hidden crisis forced the Army to face a more uncomfortable equation. You can have the best weapons, the best training, and a massive budget, but if the people inside the system stop believing, the system stops working. Morale in this context was not a nice to have. It was not a bonus. It was not a luxury. It was the central engine of obedience. When morale dropped low enough, obedience didn't just weaken. It inverted. The people who were supposed to follow orders started threatening the people who gave them. Fragging was the brutal, undeniable proof that the Army's psychological foundation had failed in certain units. And once that foundation cracks, no amount of medals, promotions, or speeches can make people forget what they've already seen. Race, class, and the pressure cooker. The Vietnam War didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened at the exact moment American society was tearing itself apart. Civil rights marches, riots in major cities, deep class divisions, an unpopular draft, a generational rebellion, rising distrust in government, a widening gap between rich and poor. That tension didn't stay back home. It arrived in Vietnam packed in the duffel bags of every 18-year-old conscript. Inside the barracks, race became a fault line. Black soldiers formed soul groups for solidarity. White soldiers formed their own circles. Latino soldiers drifted between identities, trying to find where they fit. In some units, racial tension escalated into fistfights, knife attacks, bunkroom clashes, and even racially targeted fragging threats. One African-American soldier said, "In the bush we watched each other's backs. In the rear it was like being back in the projects. Different sets, different colors, different rules." White rural draftees often felt just as alienated. They ended up in the same squads, the same bunkers, the same random firefights. Everyone brought their own fears, frustrations, and grudges. Vietnam wasn't just a jungle, it was a pressure cooker, and some men exploded, others imploded. Some threw grenades outward, a few threw them inward. A system built to fight one war, forced to fight another. The U.S. military was designed to fight. Conventional armies, clear battle lines, defined objectives, structured campaigns. Vietnam offered none of that. The war was murky, nonlinear, political, psychological, full of traps, nearly impossible to measure. Instead of winning ground, units patrolled the same ambiguous areas for months, sometimes years, with little visible progress. Young Americans were asked to risk their lives for villages that were abandoned a week later, for hills that were taken and then left, for body count numbers that meant nothing, for orders they didn't understand. An older sergeant once wrote, "You can't ask men to die for a mission that changes every day and a strategy that changes every hour." When purpose becomes unclear, authority becomes fragile. And in fragile systems, even strong leaders can be targeted simply for trying to enforce rules that no longer make sense to the men living through them. The breakdown of obedience. In a functioning army, obedience has layers. 1. Willing obedience. Soldiers trust the mission and the leaders. 2. Structured obedience. Soldiers obey because the rules are clear and the chain of command is stable. 3. Fear-based obedience. Soldiers obey because punishment threatens them. 4. Conditional obedience. Soldiers obey only if the order seems reasonable. 5. Rebellion. Soldiers ignore or challenge orders. 6. Aggression toward authority. Soldiers intimidate or threaten leaders. 7. Violence against authority. Fragging. Vietnam saw units slide down this scale, one stage at a time. Not all at once. Not overnight. Not everywhere. But in the worst affected battalions, obedience reached its lowest, most dangerous stage. Some platoons functioned like democracies, others like loosely held tribes. Some resembled gangs, some resembled families, and some, the ones history remembers most, became something closer to a prison yard. Everyone armed. Everyone suspicious. Everyone calculating risk, not against the enemy, but against each other. A true fragging attempt that never made the news. This story rarely appears in books, but veterans whisper about it. In 1971, a platoon operating near Da Nang was assigned yet another sweep through a valley where they had already taken casualties. The platoon sergeant, tired of losing his men for meaningless objectives, asked the lieutenant to request a different mission. The lieutenant refused. He insisted they follow orders. That night, the platoon sergeant found something under his cot, a grenade, pin still in, placed carefully, deliberately. A message. He quietly removed it and walked to the lieutenant's bunker. He handed it to him and said, "Sir, this is what your decision looks like." The lieutenant's face went pale. He tried to speak, then stopped. The platoon sergeant continued, "Either you explain to battalion why we're not going into that valley, or you explain to God why you ignored this." The lieutenant never sent the platoon back into that valley. No report was filed. No one was punished. And the unit functioned better the next day because the threat had forced communication that should have existed in the first place. Was this fragging? Not technically. But it was the ecosystem that allowed fragging to exist. The rules had changed. Officers gave orders. Soldiers had veto power, through fear. A system operating like that is no longer a system. It's a negotiation with bullets on the table and grenades on the floor. The short tour policy that killed cohesion. One of the most destructive policies of the Vietnam War was the 12-month individual rotation system. Instead of rotating whole units, the Army rotated individuals. This meant a squad could lose its best man tomorrow. A platoon could gain a new soldier every week. No one built long-term loyalty. No one trusted replacements. No one trusted new leaders. Everyone counted down the days. Short timers were considered unreliable. A soldier on day 330 had completely different priorities from a soldier on day 10. They weren't fighting the same war. They didn't share the same mindset. They didn't form the emotional bonds that make soldiers protect their officers. An officer might try to enforce discipline on men who would be gone next month, or men who felt betrayed, or men who simply stopped caring. You cannot lead strangers through hell. And Vietnam created endless strangers in the same squad. What fragging did to the Army soul fragging didn't destroy the Army tactically. It destroyed the Army spiritually. An army isn't just weapons, ranks, uniforms, strategies, and command posts. It is a belief system, a belief that orders matter, a belief that leaders care, a belief that the mission has meaning, a belief that the people on your left and right will fight for you. When soldiers killed their officers, it wasn't just murder. It was a vote of no confidence in the entire structure, a silent referendum on a war that felt pointless, a dark acknowledgement that the institution had lost the loyalty of the very people it depended on. Fragging wasn't random violence. It was a symptom of a deeper collapse, a collapse of trust, a collapse of communication, a collapse of identity, a collapse of the invisible glue that holds any organization together. How the press and the public misunderstood fragging. When fragging occasionally appeared in newspapers, the public interpreted it as criminal behavior, drug-induced madness, rebellion from radicals, a breakdown of patriotism, a sign of the counterculture's corruption. The truth was far more structural. It wasn't rebellion, it was exhaustion, it was fear, it was trauma, it was poor leadership, it was bad policy, it was a mission with unclear purpose. It was the psychological breaking point of young men trapped in a war that didn't align with their expectations or beliefs. Fragging wasn't the disease, it was the fever. The system was sick long before the first pin was pulled. The invisible mutiny. The U.S. Army never experienced an official mutiny in Vietnam. No battalion laid down its weapons, no regiment marched against its leaders, no companies declared rebellion. But unofficially, something worse happened. A silent mutiny, decentralized, unspoken, uncoordinated, spread through some units. It took the form of refusing to go on patrol, walking slowly on purpose, pretending not to hear orders, shooting off target, filing medical complaints, ignoring radios, stalling during operations, smoking marijuana during night watches, disconnecting emotionally, and, at the very bottom, threatening or killing leaders. This wasn't mutiny by ideology. It was mutiny by exhaustion, mutiny by meaninglessness, mutiny by self-preservation. When young men feel the institution won't protect them, they stop protecting the institution. This is what fragging represented, a desperate attempt to regain control when all other avenues of control had collapsed. The real question. The story of fragging ends with a question, not an answer. How does the strongest army in the world reach a point where its soldiers begin killing their own leaders? The answer is not simple. It is not political. It is not a slogan. It is a slow process. Loss of purpose, loss of trust, loss of cohesion, loss of belief, and finally loss of control. Fragging was not the cause. It was the consequence, the final symptom of a deeper collapse. An army is more than rifles and ranks. It is belief. And in Vietnam, belief died long before the war ended. By 1973, the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam, not because they were defeated in every battle, but because the internal war had drained the will to continue. When the helicopters lifted off and the bases went dark, the jungle remained. But somewhere in those abandoned hooches, the ghosts of a hidden crisis lingered, the crisis of a force that had been asked to fight a war without unity, without clarity, and eventually without trust. Some wars are fought with bullets. Some wars are fought with belief. Vietnam was lost when belief fell silent and grenades began speaking instead.